I am so tired of hearing that vintage synthesizers are expensive. The fact is, the majority of vintage synthesizers are very affordable, and I'm going to prove it to you. In this video, I'm going to talk about and play sound demos of 65 vintage synthesizers under $2,000, 46 of which are under $1,000, and shockingly, 20 of which are under $500 with shipping. And I'm not talking about the cheap Casios and 2-op Yamaha keyboards of the 80s either. I'm talking about serious instruments that I would recommend to anybody to add to their arsenal. I've broken this video up into different chapters, that way you can jump to what you want. In this video, we're going to cover vintage digital synthesizers, virtual analogs, hybrid synthesizers, analog monosynths, and of course analog polysynths. We're also going to discuss Rackmount versions of all of those synthesizers. And at the end of the video, we'll cover some of the pricier vintage synths that I'd recommend if you have more than $2,000 to spend. Let's begin with two vintage synthesizers that are actually under $300 with shipping. Both of these are really great gateway drugs into vintage synthesizers if you want to dip your toes into the pool without too much investment. The first, at a jaw-dropping $249 with shipping, is the Korg Poly 800. Poly 800 is the easiest synth to recommend. It's all analog. It has 8 voices or 4 voices when you stack them up, so you can get 2 of the DCOs per voice. It can do really great Juno sounding strings. It's paraphonic, meaning that it doesn't have a filter per voice. All of the voices share one filter. And it's actually amazing how much that didn't bother me. I was expecting to think that the synthesizer was going to be severely hamstrung by that. But the fact of the matter is, most of the time you don't need that for strings and brass sounds anyways. It's really only polyphonic sounds like keys where you have an individual articulation per note where you start to notice it. At $249, I mean, come on, it's a no-brainer. And there was a few synths like this on Reverb that I saw, so this isn't just an outlier. The Poly 800 uses Oki MSM 5232 arcade analog oscillator chips. So it's really great for those sorts of retro chiptunesy type sounds. It can also do organs really well because it essentially works on a kind of additive model where you stack square waves together to generate a sawtooth wave or other wave shapes. And the filter's actually Korg's own KJM 2069 filter chip, which I think is the best sounding filter that they put in any of their synthesizers. It was used again in the DW 6000, 8000, and DSS-1. It's based off of the SSM 2040 filter chip, and it sounds great. Now, if you still don't think the Poly 800 sounds good, I challenge you to hit the annotation above and check out the shootout I did between the Korg Monopoly, Poly 6, and Poly 800. And see if you can hear the difference between the Poly 800 and the much more expensive vintage analog synths. The next synthesizer I'd like to talk about is the Yamaha SY22 for $284 with shipping. So the SY22 is an all-digital Rompler that sounds really gritty and beautiful, and it allows you to do some Prophet VS-like joystick movements to get some interesting modulation into the sound. I have a soft spot for vintage digital Romplers, and one big advantage of this one is it has a beautiful controller panel for free that lets you edit everything under the hood. At under $300, it's a great bargain no matter what. I would say the Poly 800 is soaking in that 80s nostalgic chiptune sort of territory. And then the SY22 is going to give you much more of that 90s vintage feel. Let's talk about the best overall value vintage synthesizers under $500. So unlike the previous two synthesizers that do feel cut down in some way, these three synthesizers to me are incredible instruments in their own right and have no business being this cheap. First up, for $333 with shipping, we have the Kawai K4. The K4 is one of my favorite, what I call ultraviolet synthesizers. That is from the era of the D50 through the early 90s, where sample plus synthesis type architecture became popular. At the time, the Kawai K1 and K4 were not as popular as the Roland D50 and Korg M1, and might have been seen as a budget version of those. And while that's true for the K1, the K4 has a fully resonant digital filter that sounds great. It's loaded up with really great samples, and some of them are the same samples in the K1 that have that really gritty 8-bit texture. At the time, that was probably seen as not so good, but the choirs in the K1 are a thing of beauty. For a modern producer, nothing gives it that PlayStation 1 gritty glow like the Kawai K digital synths. There's just this really satisfying crunch to them. And the K4 has built-in effects. You don't get the joystick from the K1, but it does have velocity and aftertouch. I always say if the Kawai K4 came out today, its specs would look pretty good. It's got 16 voices of polyphony, 256 internal waveforms, 32 different built-in effects. I just love the synthesizer, and if you want to hear more about it, I have done a live stream on it, so hit that annotation if you want to hear all of the sounds in the K4. Next up, we have a classic mid-80s hybrid synthesizer, the Korg DW6000 for $450. At under $500, it's very hard not to recommend the DW6000. It's very similar to the 8000, which came out later in the same year, 1985. But what sets the 6000 ahead of the DW8000 a little bit is it has a built-in analog chorus that was swapped for a digital chorus in the 8000. It doesn't have as many waveforms as the 8000. It also doesn't have velocity and aftertouch. If you're looking for vintage tones, I would just like to remind you that synthesizers like the PPG Wave, Prophet 5, Jupiter 8, the Oberheim OB-Series, none of them had velocity and aftertouch. So even though I too like the expressiveness of those features in modern synthesizers, if you're going for those classic tones, you probably want to turn them off anyways. So there's a way in which the DW6000, I think it's just a really compelling buy, even though it doesn't have the velocity and aftertouch of the 8000. I'm not exaggerating when I say that regardless of budget, the DW series is actually some of my favorite sounding synthesizers from the 80s. And finally, if you want a vintage polysynth that's completely analog, you can't do better than the Roland Alpha Juno 2, which I found on geartrader.net for $458 with shipping. So before I talk about the Alpha Juno, I want to talk about geartrader.net. Geartrader.net is an alternative to Reverb. It's a division of Isla Instruments, the makers of the S2400 drum machine. And they've designed this website to be a more transparent version of Reverb. And one of the big things is if you list your synthesizers on geartrader.net, the 5% commission fee is actually split between the buyer and the seller, so it doesn't hit sellers quite as hard, and it's all super transparent and easy to use. And right now, there's some really incredible deals on geartrader.net, like this Alpha Juno 2. The cheapest one I could find by comparison on Reverb was $600. We're going to be coming back to geartrader.net time and time again throughout this video for synthesizers that have better prices there than on Reverb. So I wanted to tell you about it now because I don't think everybody knows about this website yet. So the Alpha Juno 2 sounds incredible. It has this really bright, brassy sounding filter. No, it doesn't self-oscillate, but how important is that most of the time with Juno-style sounds? We will talk about the Alpha Juno 1 later on in this video, as you can get it cheaper, but they're usually around the same price. And if you can get an Alpha Juno 2 under $500, I'd recommend that, just because you get 61 keys instead of 49, and it does have velocity and aftertouch. Of course, you can always turn it off if you want to get those true Juno sounds, but the Alpha Juno 2 is an incredible analog synthesizer. It's not just for Hoover sounds. It really sounds like a Juno. And I would recommend this synthesizer over some of the more expensive Juno-style synthesizers we'll cover later on in this video. So let's talk about some bargain vintage Rackmount synthesizers you can get. Rackmount synths are often cheaper than their keyboard counterparts, although not always, like the Roland JP8080 often goes for more than the 8000, the keyboard version. But easily the best bang for your buck and the cheapest vintage synthesizer on this list would be the Proteus 2 by Emu. I have a Proteus Plus Orchestral Master Performance System, which is basically the keyboard version of that, so I'll give you a little taste of how this sounds. The Proteus was used by everybody in the 90s, from Mark Snow, the recently passed composer of the X-Files, the GoldenEye soundtrack, the Myst soundtrack. I mean, it was just everywhere. There's something about the sound of the Proteus that I prefer over Roland's version, the JV1080. I just think it's a lot less cheesy sounding, and these samples are still really good today. It doesn't do brass sounds very well, but everything else it does is still very interesting and usable. And it strikes a great balance point where it still has a sort of vintage flavor, but the increased fidelity that was possible in 1989 and 90 gives these sounds the ability to be used in a modern context. It's instant 90s nostalgia. I love the sound. It's one of the synthesizers I'm never going to sell. Next up, for a shockingly low $219, you can get the Rackmount version of the Kawai K1, the K1R. The Kawai K1, as I was talking about earlier, is known for these incredibly gritty choir sounds. And so if you're short on space and you have an extra $200 lying around, you can get a vintage digital synthesizer. There's so many wonderful sounds in the K1. Lots of frontline assembly-esque slap basses. Definitely a grittier, darker texture than the K4. And if you're a modern producer who's kind of getting tired of all of the modern synth sounds that are out there, this is an awesome way to get some vintage tones that also weren't overused in the 80s and 90s that I think sounds really special, and at $200, it's awesome. The K1 doesn't have a filter in it. It's basically just 4 parts, kind of like the D50. And so if you think you're actually going to do some synthesis, I'd recommend going for the K4. But if you're just pulling up the sounds and using it like most people use a Rompler, the K1 is awesome. And for $250, you can get a Yamaha TX81Z, the Rackmount version of their DX11, which came out in 1987. The TX81Z is famous for its lately bass preset, which was used on virtually every 90s banger. It's 8-part multi-timbral with 8 voices. It's only 4 operators instead of 6. But if you're looking for that classic Yamaha DX sound, $250 is nothing for a rack mount synth that has this much power. I think it sounds great, and it's a wonderful way to get some vintage grime into your studio, even if you have a modern FM synthesizer. There's just some magic in those old crummy digital to analog converters. Okay, those were the best bargain vintage synthesizers you can buy. Now let's move on to vintage digital synths. And let's start with the ones that began the vintage digital revolution in 1983, FM synthesizers. So despite its iconic stature and incredible build quality, you can actually buy a Yamaha DX7 for under $500, $488 to be exact. And the only reason is because they sold so many of them. So basic supply and demand curves, there's a lot of supply here. The DX7 is iconic for a reason, but there are actually 3 vintage FM synthesizers I would recommend ahead of it. The first, for only $323 with shipping, is the Korg DS8. So the DS8 is an FM synthesizer. It basically utilizes Yamaha's 4-operator FM chip. But what sets the DS8 apart from some of Yamaha's other 4-operator synthesizers is that it has some really smart controls where you can adjust, say, the brightness, the timbre of the synthesizer with a fader. So what they were trying to do is make FM synthesis more easy to tweak. It's not particularly easy to program from the front panel, but you can modify sounds very intelligently with the DS8. Korg was owned by Yamaha at the time, so they were able to use that same technology. So it basically is a Yamaha FM synth, but with a better interface. Next up, we have an absolute deal on the Yamaha SY-77. Last year, the synthesizer sold for about $700, and this year you can get them as cheap as $513. I have an SY-99, which you're going to hear, but it's essentially the same synthesizer architecture under the hood. Ooh, this one's cool. Now, the reason I'm recommending the SY-77 over the DX7 is it's essentially a DX7 Mark II under the hood with an entire Rompler engine added to it. So this synthesizer came out at a very high price point. They didn't sell as many. It didn't get the iconic nature of the DX7 D50 or the M1. But for today's producer, I think these synthesizers are absolutely killer because you can use the samples actually in the FM modulator carrier chain to do some really crazy stuff that Yamaha didn't return to for 25 years, actually. The DX7 really doesn't sound that great until you start running it through some effects, and that's where the SY series really picks up, because it has really awesome Yamaha effects to give it that sound that everybody went for in the 80s. You don't need a Dimension D, you don't need a lexicon, it's all built into the keyboard, and the effects sound great. The SY-99 had an improved effects section if you want to go that way. But for essentially the same price, $488 versus $513, I would all day, every day recommend for you to get a SY-77 over a DX7. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Casio CZ1 for $873. So unlike a lot of the cheaper synthesizers that Casio put out, the CZ1 really feels like a real flagship synth. They use a different kind of phase modulation to get the sound, and it has its own unique character. Nothing really sounds like the Casio CZ line of synthesizers, and it's easier to program than an FM synth and can sound really cool. You know, it just doesn't sound like anything else in the world. It's a very special synthesizer, and no manufacturers really come back to this type of sound. It's been kind of forgotten in the 80s. The build quality on this is exceptional, and I really think this is an underrated synthesizer for what it is. And I think if it was branded under another manufacturer's name, it would sell for a lot more money. Romplers get a bad name, but I love them. There's just something so nice about turning your brain off, pulling up a sound, and going with it. Many people buy synthesizers but only use the presets anyways. And I think at $363, the Proteus 2000 is an incredible buy. I have a 2500, which is the same synth, but just with knobs on the front panel. The Proteus 2000 is the Mac Daddy of the Proteus line, and the sample library inside of it is vast. There are so many sounds, and they all sound great while still retaining a little bit of vintage quality. Unlike earlier Proteuses, the 2000 series has a full synthesis engine with a bunch of different filter types, ADSRs, all of that. And if that wasn't enough, they are expandable, so you can swap the Proteus 2000 card out with the other Proteus rack mounts from the era. The drums in this sound great. At under $400, I think it is a really great complement to an analog synthesizer. It can't give you the power of an analog synth, of course, but for all of the other sounds you could ever want, they're probably in the Proteus 2000. Next up, we have the Korg ONW for $650. Now, the Korg O1W is sort of the update to the Korg M1, and I would prefer it over the M1 in the sense that it has more expanded synthesis capabilities, especially wave shaping. Now, it's arguable whether the O1W is a Rompler or a synthesizer, but it doesn't have a resonant filter, just like the Korg M1. So I have it here in the Rompler section. I think it's where it makes the most sense. It does have a lot of features and a very powerful sequencer. It's basically the red-headed stepchild between the Korg M1 and the Triton and the Trinity later Korg synths. And I think it's underappreciated, and at $650, that's a very good deal for one of these guys. Next up, we have my favorite category of vintage synthesizers, what I have called ultraviolet synths. I used to just call all of these synths vintage digital. However, it's occurred to me that synthesizers like the D50 have very little in common with synths like the DX7. Virtually all digital synthesizers from 1978 with the release of the Synclavier to 1986 were FM synthesizers. That all changed in 87 with the D50. Roland's new LA synth combined samples to give realistic attack to the sounds with virtual analog synthesis, and this paradigm was copied by all of the manufacturers. I've coined the term ultraviolet to refer to this period of synthesizers from 1987 to about 1995 or so with the release of the Nord Lead virtual analog synthesizer, which itself started a new paradigm of digital synthesis. And I borrowed the name from ultraviolet crush, the term used to describe the aesthetic of many early 90s music videos. So let's jump in with some Rackmount ultraviolet synths. The best deal I could find was on a D550, which is the Rackmount version of the D50, the synth that started the ultraviolet revolution, for only $460. $460 is a really great deal. This is substantially cheaper than the keyboard version of the D50, and they usually don't sell this cheap. So if you can get one for this price, it's a really good deal. The D50 really needs no introduction. It is one of the most famous synthesizers of all time. If you want to make your own sounds with a D550 or a D50, I've actually done a tutorial on that. I'll put an annotation up above. It's not nearly as complicated as people make it out to be. I love the sound of the D50. It is the best sounding digital synthesizer of all time, in my opinion, even better than the mighty JD800. Next up, for $465, we have the Rackmount version of the Korg Trinity, the Korg Trinity TR. This synth does not sound exactly like a Trinity, actually. It's worth checking out Thoughtform's video on this synth, but it is the perfect synth for those ambient types of music in the 90s, those drum and bass and down-tempo jams. It's just got this wonderful, gritty, vintage digital character, and it is very great sounding and a little bit warmer, I think, than the keyboard version. For $465, it is a great deal to get some of that character that sounds a little bit more high fidelity than something like the Kwai digital synths. And for just over $1,000, you can get a Roland JD990. The JD990 is the rack mount version of the JD800. The 990 is one of those coveted rack mount synths because it actually improves upon the architecture of the JD800. The JD800 did not have a ring modulator. The D50 did, but it wasn't that good, so I think they left it out of the JD800, but people wanted it in there, so they added it into the 990. With the JD800 costing more and having a notorious red glue problem with the key beds, I think the 990 is a really compelling way to get those later Roland LA sounds into your music. Okay, let's talk about the best keyboard ultraviolet synthesizers. We've already looked at the Kwai K1R. For $260, you can actually get the keyboard version, which is nice because it comes with a joystick. But let's skip over that and talk about another really compelling buy under $500, which is the Ensoniq VFX for only $399. The Ensoniq VFX is the next synthesizer that took over from their ultraviolet synth, the SQ80. The SQ80 is a rare synthesizer that has this LA architecture like the Roland D50, but has analog filters, which makes its price much more expensive. The VFX loses the analog filters, but retains the polyphonic aftertouch and adds effects. So although it can't get as squelchy and warm as an SQ80, it really sounds incredible. I know that this synthesizer is under the radar for a lot of people, but I think at this price point right now, it is an incredibly compelling buy because these synths are super unique and they weren't as popular as the M1 or D50, DX7, yada yada. So there's going to be a lot of sounds in them that haven't been overused in the same way. And the Ensoniq synths are very easy to program. I used to have a dedicated SynthArc programmer for my SQ80, and I ended up selling it because I found it was just so easy to program the SQ80 without the hardware programmer. And the VFX is essentially the same architecture, just without the resonant analog filter. Getting a VFX for $399 is a real deal because last year they were going for about $600 at the cheapest. So if you're interested in this type of synth, now is the time to strike. Next up, we have a real beast of an ultraviolet synth, the Kurzweil K2000 for $447. This synthesizer basically is a sampler plus virtual analog synthesizer known for its incredible distortion characteristics. And it came out in '91 and was used by almost all of the industrial bands like Nitzer, Ebb, Nine Inch Nails, Frontline Assembly, as well as other bands like Pink Floyd. Kurzweil pioneered what's called VAST, or Variable Architecture Synthesis Technology, which is a highly flexible, basically modular way to work inside of the synthesizer. Because the K2000 isn't as popular as some of the other synthesizers on this list, I've seen quite a wide range of prices, so if you can get one at under $500, that is an absolute bargain. If you're looking for the keyboard version of the D550, you can get a D50 for $730. And finally, we have the Mac Daddy of all of the ultraviolet synths, the Roland JD800 for $1,844. The JD800 was Roland's attempt at bringing synthesis back to what it's all about, creating your own sounds. And the way they did that was by festooning this bad boy with 59 faders. So it's essentially like the Roland D50 with a PG-1000 built into it, but it has a higher fidelity sound and snappier response times. If you're in the market for a JD800, I have to caution you about the red glue problem. So these keybeds will secrete a red glue that will eventually destroy the keybed if left unchecked. So you either need to have the red glue treated or the keybed completely replaced. Now, most JD800s on the market will have already addressed this issue, but it is something you need to be aware of. So if you see a JD800 with a substantially lower price than this, you had better make sure that the red glue problem has been addressed. Unfortunately, Roland didn't sell that many of these synths because the Korg Wave Station came out, created a lot of the same types of sounds, and was substantially cheaper. And that's a perfect segue to talk about our next category of vintage digital synths, wave sequencing synthesizers. All right, so you might be thinking to yourself, wait a second, wave sequencing synthesizers, isn't there only the Wave Station? And the answer is no, there actually were other synthesizers that did wave sequencing in the 90s. They just had to come up with a different name for it so that it was legally distinct. We'll talk about some of those synths later, but for now, let's start off with the Mac Daddy, the Wave Station EX for $665. Dave Smith of Sequential Circuits, Prophet 5, and MIDI fame was taken on by the Yamaha team after Sequential Circuits closed and then taken over by Korg, and they invented the Wave Station, and it uses this novel idea of instead of having a single wave ran through a filter, what if you could have a series of waves? And the sounds that they were able to create with the Wave Station are the best presets of all time. Now, a lot of people didn't like certain things about the Wave Station when it came out. For one, it didn't have any drums, it didn't have a resonant filter, and it didn't have all of the waves from the Prophet VS. So the following year, 91, they doubled the memory inside of the EX, added a piano sound, things like that people wanted out of a keyboard at the time, and they launched the Wave Station EX. Now, a lot of the times in the vintage market, they hover around the same price, and if you had to pick one, why wouldn't you go with the EX? However, all of the iconic sounds are from the original Wave Station, so if you see a good deal on one of those, that's a great buy too. So if you could spring for a little bit more, for $699, you can get the Wave Station AD, arguably the most coveted version. It's the Rackmount version of the synthesizer, and importantly, it has a vocoder. So the WaveStation AD gives you the ability to run stuff into the WaveStation, which is really powerful. And it's the Rackmount version. It's very cool, and it's about the same price, so I thought I should include it in this list. Now, if you want to get a wave sequencing synthesizer that you can actually program, your best bet is the Ensoniq TS series of synthesizers. Right now, there's an Ensoniq TS12 for $1,425, which is $835 more than the same synth was listed for last year at $590. I have an Ensoniq TS10, basically the same synthesizer, but with a polyphonic aftertouch keybed. Here's how it sounds. The TS series from Ensoniq use hyperwaves, which is their version of wave sequencing. It's a little more rudimentary. It's not quite as powerful as what the WaveStation can do, but the Ensoniq interface is so much easier to interact with. And it also has the DP4 effects built in, which are superior to the WaveStations. It's honestly worth buying the synthesizer for the effects alone. The Ensoniq TS series is the last set of synthesizers that Ensoniq put out that was complete. They are basically the extension of the ESQ1 and SQ80, VFX, SD1, all the way up to before the Fismo, which never really was finished. And I think the Ensoniq TS series is like the prime candidate for synthesizers that have kind of fallen through the cracks of synth history. Next up, let's talk about wavetable synths. So I'm defining wavetable synths here in a somewhat modern sense, because back in the day, synths like DW8000s were considered wavetable synths or lookup synths because they looked up a table of waves. But most of the time when people think about the phrase wavetables, they think about it in the context of the modern synthesizers like Massive and Serum that allow you to morph from one wave to another. The first synth that allowed you to do that basically is the PPG Wave, although it did not have smooth interpolation. It was more like a series of snapshots, and you could hear the changes if you moved slowly enough. So what synthesizers could you get that do this sort of wavetable morphing? Well, the best option, in my opinion, is another Ensoniq synth, the immediate predecessor to the TS series, which is the Ensoniq SD1 for $849. So although the VFX and the TS series have trans waves in them, which is their phrase for talking about this morphing wavetable thing, the SD1 has the most out of any Ensoniq synth, which is a shame that the TS series doesn't have all of the trans waves from the SD1. But the advantage here is for $849, you have a very, very similar synth to the TS series. You've got polyphonic aftertouch, and you have these morphing waves. Next up, if you want one of the most powerful wavetable synthesizers that you can actually afford, the Waldorf Microwave XT from 1998 is going for only $1,329 right now. The XT takes the best of the Waldorf Microwave series, which in itself inherited its waves from PPG, and adds a bunch of knobs so that you can actually control and make your own sounds without the use of something like an expensive programmer. Even though it's an all-digital affair, this is different than their Q series, which was more of a virtual analog thing. There's such a grit and aggression to this synthesizer, and it's coveted by many modern EBM acts like Phase Fatale. $1,300, not exactly cheap for a rack mount synth, but a very powerful, legendary synthesizer in its own right. I, for one, much prefer this sound of Waldorf over their later virtual analog synths. And finally, we're actually going to discuss a hybrid synthesizer next, even though we're talking about wavetable synths, and that is the mighty Waldorf Microwave from 1989. So this is really the synthesizer that started it all for Waldorf. It's their first synth. And like I said earlier, it inherits its waves from the PPG. So it's essentially a PPG in a rack mount form. For shy of $2,000, it's pretty incredible to have a PPG with actual analog filters. And if you're into the wavetable thing, there really isn't anything better than the PPG as far as all of those classic sounds that we now identify with wavetable synthesis. I've never had one myself, but this is one of those synths I'm always keeping my eye on the market for. I'm hoping one day to get a really good deal on one. If you've made it this far in the video, please like and subscribe to help keep the channel alive. Researching, writing, recording, and editing videos like these is more brutal than it might seem. If you've enjoyed this video so far, please consider becoming a member. It's $5 a month, and it helps make it possible for me to keep making videos. In addition to the emojis you get to use during live streams, there's also members-only videos. The most recent ones have been sound design videos on the Oberheim Matrix 12 and Roland JX10. And thank you very much to the 50 or so people who are already members of this channel. You guys rock. So let's talk about a new category I haven't spoken of before in these videos, virtual analog synthesizers. So to compare the ages of vintage digital synths to dinosaur ages, let's go with the FM era, being the Triassic from 1978, to the launch of the Roland D50 in 1987, starting the Jurassic era, or the Ultraviolet era, of sample plus synthesis synths. In 1995, with the launch of the Clavia Nord Lead, we enter the Cretaceous era of virtual analog synths. So unlike the ultraviolet era of synthesis that was more focused on samples and lookup tables stacked on top of some synthesis, the virtual analog era was marked by a return to the glory of vintage analog synths covered in knobs, paired with the new power of DSP to create incredible unison stacks that we lovingly call super saws. First, let's talk about the best rack mount virtual analog synths. The rack mount format really took off in the 90s, and the best I could find was the Nord Lead 2 rack for $535.
Dream machine, dream machine, dream machine, dream machine.
Although the original Nord Lead was released in 1995, for whatever reason, the Nord Lead 2 is considered the most iconic version, which was released in 1997. It's funny looking back on this era because I've recently had the chance to interact with a Nord Lead 2 rack, and it must have felt like a breath of fresh air in 1997 to just have all of the knobs you could want in front of you and to bring you back to the roots of actually making your own sounds. I think people had gotten really tired of workstations just being loaded up with megabytes of samples and everybody sounding like everybody else. So the ability to create your own sounds, I think people were really excited about that. I'm going to be honest, of virtual analog synths, this is not my favorite. I think the sound is kind of dull for its era. The idea was, unlike the viruses that came out around the same time, I want to say the A came out in 97 as well, the Lead series removes a lot of the high end to avoid aliasing. And if you're into music from this era, that is absolutely the sound. So many great records came out using these types of synthesizers. For me, I'm a little spoiled for choice with vintage analog synths, and whenever I go for one of those bread and butter analog synth sounds, I probably just am going to go to an analog synth over a virtual analog. And I think among the virtual analogs, the Nord Lead 2 is a good buy for you if you love the nostalgia of that era. If you just want to make your own sounds with a virtual analog synth, I would recommend one of the following synths. For $625, you can get a Waldorf Micro Q rack mount synth. Waldorf Micro Q is the smallest version of the Q lines of virtual analog synths Waldorf put out after the microwave series. And I think it does a very good job, probably the best sound to my ears of capturing an analog synth. It's got that really great Germanic quality, though, that I love in Waldorf synths. There's a cleanliness to the sound, even when you crank up the overdrive. This synthesizer has a polyphony of 25 voices, which I think is enough. It's expandable up to 75, which is crazy to me. Comparing it with the lead series for a second, you've got 5 oscillators per voice here and 2 filters per voice, which can do all of different types, including comb filters, things like that. So I think this is a very powerful virtual analog synth that has, again, kind of been slept on by time. And at only $90 more than the Nord Lead 2 rack, I think is a really great buy. At $715, you can actually get a Novation Supernova rack. Now, what's super cool about the Supernova as compared to the other virtual analogs that came out in 1998 is the way that you can have 7 effects per part. So it's a multi-timbral synth. And a lot of times on multi-timbral virtual analog synths, different parts would have to share effects, but not so on the Supernova. You can actually use 7 different effects per part without any loss of polyphony. So Novation would go on to make many other really great synths, but I think the Supernova line deserves a second look as well. Next up, let's talk about the best virtual analog keyboards. At $739, you can buy an Access Virus A, the virus that started it all. I love the sound of the virus. I feel like when I started making music in the 2000s, everybody had one. And I think for good reason. There's a mixture of harshness and attitude that the viruses have that the others of the time didn't, but they could still emulate analog synths decently well too without being too plasticky. To this day, I still think the Virus series has a certain fullness that's missing from similar synthesizers. You can also find Virus Bs, Cs, and even some of the newer ones at around this price point. But for me, I think there's something cool about going all the way back to the first one that came out in '97. Next up, we have the big blue king of the virtual analogs, the Roland JP8000. JP8000s have been going up in price a lot since I sold mine. The cheapest price I could find for one on Reverb was $890, but on Gear Trader I was actually able to find one for $768, including the shipping. So once again showing that you should be checking Gear Trader for gear as well as reverb, because you can find a lot of really great deals over there. The JP8000 needs no flowers from me because it introduced the world to the phrase supersaw. What is a supersaw? It's stacking many sawtooth waves across the stereo spectrum. It's a sound that's emulated in every plugin in the world nowadays. And the original incarnation does have a certain beauty to it because of the way that the supersaw aliases. It adds this wonderful brightness. There's a certain character to the synthesizer. I also love the feedback oscillator, which is a very underemphasized part of this synth. I found the JP8000's layout to be the best of almost any synth I've explored. It had touch strips on it. It was really incredible. I really only sold mine because the build quality of the JP8000 was not so great, and I was going to put more money into repairing it than it was probably worth. But if you can find one that's in great condition for this price, I would say to jump on it. I imagine these are only going to go up in price because there is something really iconic to this era of Roland sound. I think the previous era of Roland, the JV series, kind of is known for its cheesiness, but there's still a fondness for the trance music that was made for the JP8000. When you think of the great synflation of the 2020s, it's really two things: Stranger Things and Blinding Lights by The Weeknd. Both of those cultivated a nostalgia for the 80s and those synth tones that we associate with it. And I don't think anybody's really cashed in on the 90s yet. But all it's going to take is one hip-hop producer to do a whole song with the JP8000 and some 90s drum machine, and holy shit, the prices of these synths would explode. And finally, if you want to get the Nord Lead 2, but with a keyboard, you can get it for $775. One really curious thing you might have noticed is that from the cheapest of the virtual analog keyboards I could recommend to the most expensive one, there's only a spread of $36. For whatever reason, all of these virtual analog keyboards are culminating right around the $750 price point. And I think it's a supply and demand thing. The demand for these synths is not particularly high, although it has been growing over the past few years as more and more people are becoming nostalgic about the 90s. But I think enough of these synthesizers were manufactured at the time that we haven't hit that critical mass of supply dwindling below the demand yet, where the prices will start to go up substantially. So my prediction would be in the next 5 to 10 years, these synthesizers will become quite valuable. But right now, these synths are still tortoising their way to the finish line. The final category of vintage digital synthesizers I want to talk about quickly are additive synthesizers. Let's go back to 1987 to the Kawai K5 additive synthesizer, which you can get for a measly $535. Although additive synthesis was already used in the earlier Kwai K3, which we will get to later on in this video, the K5 is really the first fully fledged additive hardware synthesizer, where all of the sounds are made additively. What is additive synthesis? Well, it's essentially creating a sound from its core building blocks, sine waves. Unlike traditional subtractive synthesis that might have only an oscillator per voice or two, maybe three, additive synthesis can have up to 128 partials per voice. So that's 128 discrete oscillators, each with their own ADSR. And this allows you to create sounds that were unheard of before this. The problem with additive is that it is ungodly complicated. And so in 1996, Kwai released the K5000S, which was their Hail Mary attempt to create the greatest synthesizer of all time. These synths used to go for a lot more money, but right now you can get a K5000S for only $805. I had a K5000S, and it is an incredible synthesizer. It's a great master key bed, and some of the sounds in it that it could make were totally unreal alien soundscapes. The 16 real-time knobs that you have, although premium and feel great, really still feel like you're only tweaking the sound. As far as a synthesizer that felt like it was easy to make your own sounds, I didn't feel like it was there. And unfortunately, I just didn't have the time to put into the synthesizer to learn how to use it properly. And so I decided to let it go to someone else who did. Unfortunately, sales of the K5000 series wasn't what Kwai was looking for, and they shut down their synthesizer department. They haven't made a synthesizer since. All right, let's talk about vintage analog monosynths. And where better to start than the best acid synthesizer you can get? So the Roland TB303 started the acid craze, and right now you can get one of those for just under $3,000. But what I think is a much better way to spend your money would be on a $493 Novation base station rack. Station is a really cool analog monosynth that came out at a time where everybody was going digital. And one of the big features of this synth is it had modern MIDI control, so you could control everything with MIDI CCs, and that made it a very flexible synthesizer. And in fact, it was used for the intro of More Human Than Human by White Zombie. It uses DCOs, and to my ear has always had a distinctly 90s kind of flavor to it, not as thick as the vintage analog sounds of the 80s and 70s, but still a really cool synth to check out at such a great price point. I think it's fair to say that on the whole, Moog synths command the highest prices of any manufacturer. People love the sound of that ladder filter ever since Bob Moog introduced it in his first synthesizer in 1964. And like many other vintage synthesizers, people assume the prices to be astronomical when they just aren't. So if you want a true vintage Moog synthesizer, you only have to pay $632 for a Moog MG1. The reason the price is not so high is the MG1 was the best-selling synthesizer Moog ever created. And one of the other really cool things about the synth, as well as having its hands-on controls like a mini Moog, is it has a polyphonic divide-down oscillator, so it can basically do those cheesy organ sounds from the era. So it's an incredibly feature-packed analog monosynth for its price point, and it is a true Moog synthesizer. So I think if you're looking for an authentic vintage Moog sound, but you don't want to spend an arm and a leg, the MG1 is the perfect synth for you. And if I was to recommend any vintage Moog synthesizer this year, it would absolutely be a Moog Prodigy for $995. This is the best deal of the year because the price has gone down $425. Last year, the same synth was selling for $1,420. So scoop this synth up while you can. The Moog Prodigy is very similar to a mini Moog. The biggest omission that I can think of is it doesn't have a noise source. And as Starsky Carr called it, it is all sweet spot. It's basically everything you could want from a vintage Moog. It's got that sound. It's got a very easy to use interface. I had a Moog Source, which is a very similar synthesizer, but it was locked behind a membrane panel interface. So although that synth is technically more powerful, I would recommend the Prodigy for its ease of use and instant charisma. I have no doubt that the price of these synthesizers are going to go back up sooner rather than later. So if you can get one around this price point, go ahead and pull the trigger. And finally, if you want a mini Moog, but you're not that fussed about the name, I would actually recommend the Roland SH2 for $1,565.
straight going to hell.
I know this is a lot more than the Prodigy, but depending on when you watch this video, all the Prodigies sub $1,000 might be sold out. And the thing about the SH2 that I love is its interface. It's the best interface of any synthesizer I've ever played. It's just brilliantly thought out. And you have the advantage of a sub oscillator on top of two oscillators. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds of the Mini Moog and the Roland SH101, although it doesn't have a sequencer. In doing a shootout between the Moog Source, which is essentially a Mini Moog, so much so that as they stopped production of Mini Moogs, they took the leftover parts of the Mini Moogs that weren't completed and just started putting them into Moog sources because they're essentially the same thing under the hood. And in the shootout, I thought the SH2 sounded incredibly similar. So much so that I think that Moog could have sued Roland over it. But you do have the advantage also of pulse width modulation, which of course none of these old Moogs could do. It has a slightly more feral characteristic to it as well, but the filter is uncannily like a ladder filter. So I think if you're looking for something like a Mini Moog that also has a sub oscillator and can do pulse width modulation, you should check out the SH2. Next, let's talk about the best overall analog monosynths of the year, starting with the Roland SH101 for $1,239. This is one of the most famous synths of all time, and they used to hover around closer to $1,500, but recently the prices have come down. The SH101 has a really famous sequencer, one VCO-Per-Voice with a sub-oscillator, and has been used by every famous artist from the era. The SH101 has the same IR3109 filter chip from the Roland Jupiter 8, and there's a reason that it's been cloned so much in Eurorack and by other manufacturers. Next up, we have my favorite vintage analog monosynth, the only one I can't imagine myself ever selling, which is the Formanta Polyvox for $1,599, up from $1,140 last year, which is a $459 price increase. So I told everybody to get a Polyvox last year, and it looks like at least a few of you did, because there's no more that are selling at that like $1,150 price point. Now we are up to about $1,600. So if you bought one when I told you to, good on you. I love the Polyvox. There's no way to say it. I have a taste for harsher industrial edge that the Polyvox gives. I think it is one of the most beautiful sounds ever. I think the problem with it is a little bit of a one-trick pony. Even with the resonance all the way down, you do still get that famous squelch from the Polyvox filter that you'll never get from any other synth. And that's a good and a bad thing. I mean, it's always going to sound like a Polyvox. It's never going to do something that doesn't sound like a Polyvox. It is one of those cases where I can't make the argument that it's better because of its features. The cross mod on it is not anything to write home about. It does have loopable envelopes and it is duophonic. I don't really think that matters as much. To me, what really makes the synth sound the way it does is just that incredible filter. And it's one of those synthesizers I'll never sell. Moving on, if you want something that has a little more depth to it but still retains that ferocious edge, you can't do better than a Korg MS-20 for $1,707. The MS-20 has refused to let its price fall. These synthesizers always command on the upper end of this section of the vintage analog market. Luckily, a lot were made, or else this synthesizer would sell for a lot more. This synth essentially gives you the semi-modular patchability of something like an ARP 2600 in a much smaller package. Now, they're not as aggressive as the Polyvox or indeed many other synths when it comes to resonance. That's not really the point. The way they break up is so interesting and musical, and the synth just has this natural saturation to it, which of course you can amplify by patching the headphone out back into it and really shredding it. And finally, the coolest vintage analog monosynth I can think of is the Korg Monopoly, which you could get right now for $1,890. It took a little bit for the Monopoly to grow on me. I think I was too quick to try to compare it to the Poly 6. And it simply doesn't do polyphonic as well as the Poly 6 does. I think the Monopoly really shines in its ancestor to wave sequencing, stepping through the different waveforms using the arpeggiator. So each oscillator can be a different waveform at a different range, and it really does lend itself to creating really interesting experimental textures and evocative sounds that you still don't really hear nowadays. But for me, where the Monopoly really shines is when you kick it into unison mode and you have a 4 oscillator analog monosynth behemoth. Because you have individual control over each of the wave shapes, the range, the tuning, you can create some truly ungodly, massive stacks of sound that don't sound like a virtual analog supersaw, but instead have this warm, aggressive grit to it. I've said grit so many times this video, but it's true. There's just this beautiful growl that happens with those 4 oscillators forced through that SSM filter. There are some sounds that only a monopoly can create, and vintage ones used to go for a lot more money. So $1,890 I actually think is a really good bargain for these. Next up, let's briefly touch on samplers. So we'll start with the best rack mount sampler of the year. And for me, that's the $841 Akai S900. The S900 really started a new revolution in samplers, and this 12-bit rack mount format was perfect. In my opinion, 12-bit is the sweet spot for samplers. The 8-bit era is really crunchy, like so crunchy that sometimes it's amazing if it's the right sound, but it doesn't work on everything. And then by the time you move to 16-bit, aka CD quality audio, you've sort of lost that magical grit that made vintage samplers so unique. The S900 was used by an insane number of artists, especially in the jungle and hip-hop genres. Fatboy Slim, Front 242. There's a reason it's such an iconic sampler, and it's relatively easy to use. It still has analog filters in it, which the newer, later models of the Akai rack mount samplers would lose. So I think this really is a great sampler to get. Now, if we're talking keyboard samplers, well, there's no discussion of keyboard samplers without the Ensoniq Mirage, which you can get at an incredible $550 right now.
Ooh! Shit, bitch. Ooh. You can really hear that grittiness.
This sampler really is a classic and was the first sampler to come out that was actually affordable. And Ensoniq has always made awesome products, and this was their first real product on the synthesizer market. I love the Mirage. I had it. The only reason I sold it is because its interface is so labyrinthine, and it's even in the best conditions, you're not guaranteed to actually set the loop points in a way in which they won't click. And like I said, that 8-bit nature isn't perfect for every sound. It works on about half the sounds, in my opinion, maybe only a third really, that benefit from that amount of digital distortion. But the sounds that it does work on are incredible. Next up, we have the EMU Emax from 1986 for $842. The Emax was used by Nine Inch Nails, of course, all over Pretty Hate Machine, sort of the secret weapon of that record. And this is what I'm talking about when it comes to being a 12-bit powerhouse. This is kind of the sweet spot where you've got enough vintage digital grit, a little bit of grime on the sound, but not so much that it overwhelms the content. Trent Reznor said about the Emax, and I'm paraphrasing here, that essentially because it doesn't have an anti-aliasing filter, as you tune things down, it gets brighter, whereas on the S900, when you tune things down, it gets duller. So for fans of industrial or Depeche Mode that use the Emax quite a bit, I think the EMU Emax is a much better alternative to the more pricey emulators and essentially has the same features. Finally, if you have the money, the Mac Daddy of samplers that I would recommend is the Korg DSS-1 for $1,220. This is a massive price increase of $645 from last year. Now, the reason I think the price has gone up so much is these samplers are giant. So most people only want to sell them locally, and I've excluded that from my list of synthesizers. So you can find them at cheaper prices if there happens to be one near you. The Korg DSS-1 is essentially a DW8000 with two sets of digital delay lines, so you could do chorus and delay at the same time, as well as an additive synth engine built in. So it's probably the most fully featured sampler of the 80s, and it is an incredible thing. Again, I love the sound of the KGM 2069 filter. I think the only thing that holds it back is the interface is a little bit cumbersome to program. Although it does have two input sliders, so you can control two parameters at once, it could still take a while to program as compared to maybe some of the other samplers on this list. I don't know, they're all pretty hard to program now that I think about it. It's just the nature of vintage samplers. Let's talk about the most underrated category of vintage synthesizer, hybrid synths. Let's start with the best bargain you're going to get on a vintage hybrid synthesizer, the Ensoniq ESQ1 for $450. Until 1985, the PPG Wave reigned king as far as hybrid synthesizers go, and it was very expensive. In 85, we see Ensoniq come out with the ESQ1 and Korg come out with the DW6 and 8000. And the ESQ1 really is an incredible synthesizer. You have digital oscillators fed through analog filters, and the flavor of the ESQ1 as compared to the DW synths is much more aggressive, much more masculine. Honestly, sounds like an Oberheim is the best way I can describe it. There's this real crunch and growl to the filter that's beautiful. The ESQ1 also has a better interface. It's very easy to program this synthesizer. It does not have the polyphonic aftertouch of the SQ80 that we'll talk about soon, but it is a really cool synth. Next up, for only $49 more, we finally get to talk about one of my favorite vintage synths of all time, the Korg DW8000 for $499.
Do you dream, Elliot? You scraping so hard like you ain't never asked yourself this before. I said, do you want to be here right now? And I don't mean like here, I mean here in a cosmic sense, bro. Like, existence could be beautiful or it could be ugly. But that's on you.
I know which one's for me.
Dream. You gotta find out the future you're fighting for. Sometimes you gotta close your eyes and really envision that shit, bro. If you like it, then it's beautiful. If you don't, then you might as well fade the fuck out right now.
Korg a lot of the times likes to hang back in the market and sort of just pick out the best features of synths that are coming out around the time and try to slide in a price point underneath their competitors. But in the case of the DW8000, there's a lot of real innovation going on. This is the first synthesizer, I believe, that's ever had an onboard digital delay added into it. So effects weren't really a part of synths aside from analog choruses. And the 6000 has the analog chorus. The 8000 has a digital delay line which can be used as a chorus, and it actually sounds really good. But the biggest thing about this synthesizer is it does have velocity and aftertouch that you don't get with the ESQ1. So for a $49 difference, and it's also the same $49 difference to the 6000, I think it's worth that extra little bit to get the velocity and aftertouch, although those synths are really cool as well. It also has twice as many waveforms as the 6000. But the big thing though is that filter, the KJM2069. I've talked about it a lot in this video so far. It is the best sounding filter in my opinion. It's based off of the SSM2040 chip from the Prophet 5 and PPG Wave. It's got this wonderful sing-song quality. It's not nearly as brutal and aggressive as the Ensoniq filters. It's just got a magical sound to it. And when I first cranked the resonance on it, I suddenly understood why people love vintage synthesizers. I've tried to restrain myself to only 3 synths per category, but in this case, we're going to add one more for $52 more. So that's only $551. You can get a Kawai K3. The Kawai K3 was called the poor man's PPG because one thing it can do that these other synths can't is it can morph between waves with aftertouch. Maybe morph isn't the right word, it's more like blend from oscillator A to oscillator B. And another big feature that this synth has that its competition doesn't, a full additive synthesis engine built into it. Now this isn't as fully implemented as the K5 that would come out the following year. That is, each partial doesn't have its own ADSR, but you can create additive waveforms in this very meticulously. I recommend using something like a controller panel to do so. But the K3 really is an incredible instrument. In some ways, it doesn't compare favorably to the DW8000 or Ensoniq synths, because the oscillators do kind of fall apart in the lower register, and the filter isn't driven as hard, so it doesn't quite have that same magic that the other ones do, but it makes up for that with its really characteristic dark, glassy sound. And the K3 for me is just another one of those synths I can't imagine myself ever selling because it's just so unique. I've recently done a live stream on the history of the Kawai K3, so if you're interested in that, please check out the annotation above. And finally, the best hybrid synthesizer I could possibly recommend is still under $1,000 at $825, the Ensoniq SQ80. Now, the price on this one's a little weird because there just were no SQ80s for sale with shipping. So I had to look at the local prices, and I just added $200. That felt like the high end of what someone would charge for shipping. So $625 plus $200 is $825 to get that price. The SQ80 has polyphonic aftertouch, which became Ensoniq's signature throughout the 90s. The thing about polyphonic aftertouch on a synth like this is it really adds a level of expression. I mean, this is a feature that's still kind of considered like cutting edge today with synths like Polybrute 12 and the Hydra synth employing it, and modern flagships like Moog Muse not even having polyphonic aftertouch. So to be able to get a vintage polyphonic aftertouch synth for less than $1,000, I mean, that's just incredible. But the real power of the SQ80 is that it's essentially an LA synthesizer like the Roland D50. It comes with a lot of attack samples that you can use at the start of the synth sounds. And it's got a bunch of breathy waveforms too that are kind of missing from the D50. So you can kind of take it into that more Korg Triton sort of territory, but with a great analog filter. And it has a similar but different analog filter from the ESQ1. And again, it's got that more crunchy, aggressive, Oberheim growly type character to it than the more beautiful, feminine DW filters. All right, you guys have been great for watching this far. We have finally arrived at the category you've all been waiting for: big, bad, analog polysynths. First, let's talk about the best Rackmount analog vintage polysynth you can buy, which is the Oberheim Matrix 1000 for only $650.
This patch just keeps going. It's like a wave station patch. Man, talk about like ambient patches that could be played with this. Do a whole ambient album just listening to this filter sing.
The Matrix 1000 is based on the Matrix 6, which in my opinion is the best sounding DCO analog polysynth of the 80s. It's almost identical under the hood. The only major difference between the 1000 and the 6R, which is the Rackmount version of the Matrix 6, is its high frequency oscillators come from a digital clock as opposed to voltage controlled high frequency oscillators in the 6 and 6R. I think in practice, that's probably not going to make any noticeable difference to the sound. And it comes with 1,000 presets. It's not going to sound like an Oberheim OB-Series, although all of those famous presets are emulated in the Matrix 1000. But I think the Matrix Synths, and to some extent the OB8, have a different sort of sound than the earlier OB synths. And they're much more complicated. I'm in the middle of making a tutorial on how to program the Matrix 6, which would also apply to the Matrix 1000. You've got 3 envelopes per voice, 2 LFOs per voice, plus a global vibrato LFO. You've got FM, ramp generators, tracking generators. I mean, it's a very complex synth. And the Matrix 1000 is not meant to be edited directly from the front panel. You need a programmer for that. And again, I'm working on a tutorial, so hopefully that'll be out on the channel soon. But that added complexity meant that you could get some really awesome sounds out of the Matrix series that weren't possible on any of the other analog DCO-80 synths. Okay, let's talk about the best Juno-style analog DCO synths of the 80s. Let's start with everybody's favorite, the Alpha Juno 1 for only $435. So we've already heard the Alpha Juno way back with the Alpha Juno 2 in the beginning of the video. But the thing is, the Alpha Juno 1 is the same synthesizer under the hood. The only difference is it doesn't have velocity and aftertouch, and it has 49 instead of 61 keys. So if you can get a good bargain on one of these, it's also really worth looking into, because if you're going for those Juno sounds, all of the other Roland Juno synths didn't have velocity or aftertouch anyways. If you can find an Alpha Juno 2 for a similar price, I would save up that extra little bit to get the 2. But the Alpha Juno 1 is nothing to shake a stick at, and under $500, it's an easy sell. Next up, we have one of my favorite vintage synthesizers of all time, the Korg Poly 6, for only $1,189. The Korg Poly 6 is a thing of beauty. It just sounds so good. I've referred to it before, and I will again, as my anti-VST synth. In this whole room of vintage synthesizers, it is the one that sounds the furthest from Serum. It has such a warmth to its oscillators. The filter is an SSM like on the original Prophet 5, so it's got this beautiful singing quality to it, and it's got great built-in effects. The only drawback, thing that holds it back from being like in the same tier as the more expensive Junos, is the chorus is not stereo, so it's a monaural chorus. That is, it's only a single output. Now, considering there's a million ways to make things wide nowadays, I don't think that hamstrings it as much as it did in the 80s. I cannot stress to you how much I love the Korg Poly 6 and think it is an incredible buy at under $1,200 with shipping. I mean, that is wild to me, because these have certainly sold for a lot more than that. Next up, at a similar price point of $1,265, we have the Akai AX60. The AX60 is up $395 from last year. The same synth we're selling for closer to $870. Kai AX60 is something of an oddball synth. It is one of the last analog polysynths to be released in 1986, and it's based on Doug Curtis's 3394 synth on a chip. So what that is a single oscillator, filter, and amplifier on a chip. So each of the 6 voices just has one oscillator, the filter, and the amplifier. And it's not going to sound as thick as the Poly 6, the Jupiter 4, or the Roland Junos because it doesn't have a sub-oscillator. What it does have is the ability to turn the triangle wave on as well as the saw or the square wave, and you can do pulse width modulation on all of the waveforms, which is something super cool. It's a very different PWM sound than, say, the Alpha Juno. But what I really think stands out about the AX60 are 2 features. One is its ridiculous amount of resonance and the ability to do filter FM. And then the other is you can connect it to something like an Akai sampler and run the sampler through the analog architecture of the AX60, basically giving you hands-on control, 1 knob per function, or I should say 1 slider per function, over a sampler that you can mix in with analog oscillators. And in this way, it's kind of the only synth I can think of that has this sort of architecture. I can't think of any samplers from this era where you could also run it with an analog oscillator through the same filters and things like that. And my understanding is that they messed up when they made the synth and made the resonance way too much. So it has this incredible screaming resonance, which on its own is pretty unpleasant, but in combination with filter FM can create some truly otherworldly sounds. So I love the AX60. It is a very weird synth though. And considering the Poly 6 is actually cheaper than this, if you're looking for this sort of Juno architecture style analog synth, I hate to say it, but the Korg Poly 6 is probably the way you should go. However, the AX60 actually does have VCOs as well, so that's something that it has going for it over the Junos. Next up, we have one of the most shocking revelations of this year's analysis of the vintage market. The Juno 106 has come down pretty significantly in price. Right now, you can get a Roland Juno 106 for $1,667. But what's mind-blowing to me is you can actually get the more legendary and usually more expensive Roland Juno 6 for less than that, $1,531. I have no idea why right now this more coveted and legendary Roland synthesizer is selling for less than the 106, but I took advantage of it and bought one myself actually. But as of the recording of this video, the one for $1,531 is still available. On paper, the Juno 106 and the 6 are very similar, but you should really check out Starsky Carr's comparison video between the 660 and 106. The 6 and the 60 have the exact same voice architecture, so they're virtually identical. The 106, it to my ears does not sound as good as the 6 and 60 which came before it. The 6 and 60 are a little fuller and a little brighter of a sound. The 106 has a little bit duller, although in some ways that can make it sound more vintage, right? But for me, I think the 6 is really compelling, especially in a modern context. So it doesn't have MIDI. Neither does the Juno 60, but it does have a DCB port, which is Roland's precursor to MIDI, which then can be converted from MIDI with a Roland DCB to MIDI converter. And of course, all of these vintage synths have MIDI kits you can have installed in them. But to me, the Juno 6 kind of represents the best version of the synth if what you care about is sound design, because the high pass filter is continuous. And the following Junos and the JXs, which I love, only have a 4 possible position high pass filter, which I don't love as much because I never seem to find the right value with that. With a high pass filter, I'd rather be able to find that sweet spot myself. And so the Juno 6 allows you to do that. It doesn't have any presets, but most people don't use the presets on Junos anyways. They just use it in manual mode, right? So for me, I think the Juno 6 is a really compelling, incredible, legendary synthesizer that you can actually buy right now. And I don't think it's going to be this way for long, but right now you can buy it for cheaper than a 106. So Juno-Style analog polysynths have one oscillator per voice, but what if you want two? Let's talk about the best two oscillator DCO analog synths of the 80s, starting with the incredible JX3P for only $709 right now. That audio you just heard was from a live stream I did creating progressive house or tech house with the JX3P only. And I was so impressed by how great this synthesizer sounds. It is easily one of my favorite sounding synths. It might be the best of the Roland analog synths as far as any that I've been able to play. It has the IR30109 filter chip in it. That's the same filter chip as the Jupiter 8 and the Juno 6 and 60, not the 106 have. And so it's going to have that sort of Jupiter flavor. Aside from not having VCOs, it is very similar to a Jupiter 8. I think it probably sounds a lot warmer than a Jupiter 8, actually. The Jupiter 8's a very bright synthesizer. And the filter, even though it is from the Jupiter 8, does not go fully into self-oscillation. So it's going to have a little bit more of a mellow sound. But having said that, it's got really great cross-mod and hard sync. And it's just a really fun, simple, well laid out synth to use. It was one of the first synths to have MIDI, and as such, the MIDI implementation's not great. You can either use the programmer or use MIDI. You can't use both at the same time, so that can be frustrating if you want to do some real-time filter tweaks or things like that while you're feeding the synth MIDI. But it does have a sequencer built in, and it has a gorgeous sounding Roland chorus. Now, there's a few other really cool 2 DCO-Per-Voice analog polysynths in this area in the vintage market. For $10 more, you could get a Korg Poly 61. Now, the thing about the Poly 61 is it has a different filter oscillator combo than the Poly 6. Some people say it doesn't sound quite as fat. Some people like synthpunk love this synth, but it doesn't have MIDI, and it is known to have the same battery leak issues that a Poly 6 might have, so just make sure you get that addressed. They came out with a 61M, a MIDI version later, so you could also look out for that if you get a good deal on it. That could be a cool synth. Another great synth for $774 is the JX8P. Now, the JX8P is another really amazing synthesizer. It has velocity and aftertouch that the 3P doesn't, and it also handles MIDI a lot better. The reason I don't have it as my recommendation is not that it's not an amazing synthesizer. It's just that I think the flavor of the IR3109 filter chip in the JX3P sounds more vintage, whereas the JX8P has the same filter as the Alpha Juno series, the IR3R05 filter chip, which is brighter and brassier. For all I know, it might actually sound closer to a Jupiter 8 because it does have that brighter sound. But if you're looking for a vintage sounding analog polysynth, I think the JX3P kind of ekes it out. But personally, I might prefer having the 8P. And at the price difference, it's really kind of more what you're looking for. Are you looking for that really warm, nostalgic, gooey analog tone from the JX3P? Or do you want like a brighter, closer to the Jupiter 8, maybe sort of brassier tone? Think Europe's The Final Countdown sort of sound that you can get from the 8P. Either way, I think both of those JX synths are really incredible. Next up, we have one of the best deals of the year. You can get an Oberheim Matrix 6 for only $1,150 this year, which is down from $1,425 last year, which I already thought was low. I love the Matrix 6. I've already talked about it with the Matrix 1000, so I won't bore you guys, but it is a thing of beauty. And I think the extra money is really justified in how great that filter sounds, as well as pulse width modulation. It doesn't have a stereo analog chorus, so if that's something you care about, you're actually better off going with one of the cheaper synths I've just mentioned. That, or you can get something like a vintage analog stereo chorus pedal from Boss, the same company as Roland. So it's the same chorus that you would get in the Juno-Synths. This is a great way, by the way, for usually about $200 to make any synthesizer sound vintage. But yeah, the Matrix 6 is, in my opinion, the best sounding DCO-based analog polysynth of the 80s. And finally, if you have the money, you can get a Kwai SX240 right now for just shy of $2,000. The SX240 is one of those synthesizers that actually took a while for me to grow on. When we did comparisons with the Matrix 6 and the JX series, I do think the SX240 sounded really great, but it was kind of arguable which of the DCO-based polysynths was the best sounding filter combination. What really sets the SX240 apart from the other DCO synths is you have 2 DCOs per voice, plus a sub-oscillator, so you've really kind of got 3 oscillators per voice. The chorus is fine. It's more of an ensemble chorus, and it's thinner, so it's really good for doing those Roland VP330 type sounds, but it is kind of overwhelming, so I actually don't use the chorus as much as I put it in dual mode. And what that is like on the Jupiter 8, where you can split half the voices to the left and half the voices to the right. Now you have this incredible binaural analog polysynth with 4 voices. It's really incredible. In my opinion, it is just one of the most gorgeous sounding analog synths ever because of that feature. And just like the Jupiter 8, it can be different patches on the left and the right. So you have 2 LFOs. So even if you're using the same patch, those LFOs will be moving separately, and it just creates this beautiful wide stereo sound that you wouldn't expect from a vintage analog polysynth. Most vintage analog polysynths are pretty mono unless they have a chorus, and the SX240 in that dual mode is just incredible. Of course, the SSM filters in it sound really great. I don't think they're quite as well implemented as they are in, say, the Poly 6. That synth just is perfection. But when you add up all of those features, you start to get something really special with the Kwai SX240. Less than 1,000 were ever made, so they're very rare and sometimes can command really high prices. So to be able to get one for under $2,000 right now, I consider that a major bargain. Next up, if you want a 12-voice analog polysynth, there's really only one I would recommend, which is the Roland JX10. The Roland Super JX is essentially two JX8Ps stacked on top of each other inside the same keyboard. That allows you to do more complex type sounds where half of the voices are creating the attack of a sound and the other half are creating the sustain. And it has incredible presets by none other than the great Eric Persing. And the soundtrack from this was used, of course, in Twin Peaks as well as a lot of David Lynch works. The presets are mostly focused on keyboard sounds and lush analog string pads. I can see an argument for the earlier JXs. They are more immediate, right? The 12 voices make it more cumbersome to program. But in my case, I found that it can really do some incredible stuff. And 12 voices gives you that ability to create those more interesting sounds. It really is like two JX8Ps. I know the LFO is slightly different op amps. Course is implemented slightly differently. But don't let the haters fool you. It is a great sounding synth. Okay, so far when we're talking about the two oscillator per voice synthesizers, we've been talking about the cheaper cost digitally controlled analog oscillators or DCO synths. But what if you want the coveted 2 voltage controlled oscillator per voice vintage analog polysynths? What are your options? First, let's talk about the sequential Prophet 600 with a Glee mod for $13.99. The Prophet 600 is a synthesizer I'm kind of conflicted on. Even with the Glee mod, there's certain things about the envelopes that really bother me. And I would not recommend an unmodified vanilla Prophet 600 really, because I just think that they bit off more than they could chew and more that the Z-Log 80 processor inside the synthesizer could handle. But on paper, it is really hard to argue with. You've got 2 VCOs per voice. They are 3340 Curtis chips. Those are the same in the OBXA and even the late and great Prophet 5 Rev 3. The filter chip is the same as the Matrix 12. It has filter FM. It's got polymod. It's got 2 envelopes, one for the filter and one for the amplifier. It's got hands-on knobs. I mean, it's basically would be the perfect synthesizer on paper. But the implementation of the synth was lacking for the time, and even with the mod, there are certain things that bother me about it. Now, I am spoiled for choice. I have some of the greatest synthesizers of all time in this room, so little things can bother me. If you only had one vintage analog polysynth, this could be the one to go for because A, you do have that hands-on control. B, they are true voltage-controlled analog oscillators, which means they will drift in and out in a musical way. It does have a little bit more life, a more breathing character to it in the oscillator section. And once you get used to the envelopes and everything, that just kind of is what it is. You just kind of get used to how the synth is. And of course, it's been used by many professional artists to make great sounds. For me, though, it does sound a little thin for whatever reason. I don't know what that is. And the problems with the envelopes are enough to annoy me to where I'm ready to sell the synthesizer. So then what would I recommend for a 2 VCO vintage analog polysynth? There's only one, and we've finally broken the $2,000 barrier with the Fender Chroma Polaris for $2,200. The Fender Chroma Polaris rose like a phoenix from the ashes of the ARP Chroma in 1984. It's the only synthesizer ever branded to be from Fender. If I had to sell everything, I probably would just keep the Chroma Polaris because it is so gorgeous. It is an aggressive sound. It has this high mid-range character to it. And like an ARP Odyssey, which it's kind of a polyphonic version of, it has a ring modulator built in, so it can create these really aggressive clangorous sounds. And then the real kind of character of the synth comes from the VCA drive. So with the VCA at like 50%, it's already overdriving pretty high, and at 100%, it's like you're running the synthesizer through a distortion pedal. It's crazy the amount of gain and distortion the synthesizer has built into it. Like the Prophet 600 or the Matrix 6, it is a monaural synth, meaning that it does not have stereo outputs, no stereo chorus or anything. But if you can get over that, you've got a polyphonic LFO. The way that the unison detune can either be standard or key tracked negatively. And what that does is it means that unlike detune on a normal synthesizer where the beating doubles every octave, the beating stays the same across all octaves. And so it actually sounds much more like an analog chorus because the beating across the entire synthesizer is the same. I think the Chroma Polaris is an incredible synthesizer. It's not for everyone though. It is aggressive. So if you're looking for a mellower, more pretty, synth poppy, Italo disco type thing, it might not be the synth for you. You probably would be better going with one of the cheaper DCO based analog polysynths I mentioned earlier, because the Polaris has a major attitude problem that I love. So after the Polaris, there's a gulf in terms of price before you get to the next vintage analog polysynth that has 2 VCOs per voice, which coincidentally is the Alesis Andromeda here I have right above my Polaris. Currently, the cheapest Andromeda in the world right now is $4,400, which is double the price of the Fender Chroma Polaris, which leads us into the discussion of vanity vintage synthesizers. So for purposes of this video, I'm going to define a vanity synthesizer as any vintage synth that costs $3,000 or more. So like I said, there's a gulf here in terms of price point. There's not that many synths listed at $3,000, $3,500, somewhere in that range. It's not to say that there's no synths listed there, but as far as the lowest price one that I could find, there's just this big gap between $2,200 and $4,400. So I have a theory about what this is. It's just conjecture here, but what I think it is that a lot of modern flagship synthesizers are right there in that $3,500, $4,000 range. So think about it. A Moog Muse is $3,500 and an Arturia Polybrute 12 is $4,000. And I think a lot of us remember, Juno 106s were going for like $2,000 at least, not that long ago. So I think there's this sort of idea of like, you either want to price your vintage synth like kind of close to that price point, right? Somewhere in $1,500 to $2,500, somewhere in there. And then there's sort of a no-fly zone when you approach what modern flagships are costing right now. Because if you list a vintage synthesizer at that price point, right, it's going to be inevitably compared to those synths. So you're going to go, okay, so the Polybrute 12 has polyphonic aftertouch, like why would I spend that much money on this synth? However, if it's priced above that, it seems premium and rare and special, and it has some magic in it that maybe you're not going to get from a modern synth. That's maybe the psychology of what's going on here. There's synthesizers in the $3,000 to $6,000, maybe $7,000 range, something like that. And then let's say $7,000 and up. Now in the $3,000 to $7,000 price range, we're talking about synthesizers where you're paying for the name and you're paying for the rarity of the synthesizer, above and beyond when we're talking about what features it has. I think the Jupiter 6, for instance, is a fine polysynth. I would love to have one, but they trade at pretty high prices, and I think the reason has more to do with the word Jupiter printed on the synthesizer than the raw features list. But at least what you can say about the vintage synths in this category, they're very expensive for a lot of people. I get that. But the prices haven't truly gone insane yet either. So there usually is some reason these synthesizers cost so much that goes beyond just the name or the rarity. For instance, the Jupiter 6, the Expander, and the Andromeda all have multi-mode filters, and we haven't seen that yet on the list so far. So that leads nicely into our first category of vintage synthesizers. What if you're looking for a SEM-Style filter in an analog polysynth? You've really only got two options, the Oberheim Expander and the Alesis Andromeda I mentioned at $43.99. Andromeda came out 25 years ago, making it newly vintage, and it is an insane synth on paper. It's got 16 voices and it's 16-part multi-timbral. Each voice has mini Moog cloned UA726 oscillators, and you can have all the oscillator shapes on at once. And then it runs through two filters. First, an Oberheim SEM-Style filter, and then a Moog ladder filter. All of that can be ran through an analog distortion, and it's got that wonderful ribbon controller on there. On paper, the Andromeda is pretty hard to beat. Even something like the Moog 1 is kind of in that territory. However, not everybody loves the sound of the Andromeda. And if you only listen to the presets, you could be forgiven for thinking that the Andromeda is the only vintage analog polysynth that does a good emulation of a virtual analog synth. There's something just plasticky about the way the effects intermingle in the sound, and so I never use them. I think it sounds really great on its own. It is a very vast, very deep synthesizer, and if there's something you want to do, you probably can do it with the Andromeda. The Andromeda has a really fascinating relationship with the Matrix 12, a synthesizer the team was open about their fondness for and emulation of. So Marcus Ryle and Michel Dwadic designed the Matrix 12, and then Marcus went on to work for Alesis and work on their Quadrasynth. And the same team that worked on the Quadrasynth went on to work on the Andromeda. So we have this sort of like Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader thing going on here with the Andromeda and the Matrix 12. So for this video, the way I'm defining a SEM-Style filter, by the way, is that it can do a notch filter configuration. All the way back in 1974, Tom Oberheim created the SEM, and it had a two-pole filter that could be smoothly morphed from low pass through notch to high pass. Then in 1975, Tom Oberheim created the first polyphonic synths ever by chaining multiple SEMs together. This resulted in the 2-voice, 4-voice, and gargantuan 8-voice polyphonic synthesizers. They weren't truly programmably polyphonic the way the Prophet 5 was a couple of years later, but it was the first time you could play giant sweeping chords with one synthesizer, and importantly, you could do so with that notch filter. I think an analog notch pad is one of the most gorgeous sounds ever created, but the notch filter wouldn't really come back around until 1984 with the expander. There were other synthesizers with multi-mode filters like the Yamaha CS70M and Jupiter 6. However, they didn't have a notch filter in them. They usually had a low pass, band pass, and high pass. And if you want to get an Oberheim expander, an incredible synthesizer, you can do so for just shy of $5,000 right now. Now, $5,000 is a titanic amount to spend on a synthesizer. I get that. However, these do tend to hover closer to $6,000 when market conditions are better. And it's no exaggeration to say that the expander might be one of the most powerful analog synths of all time. So the expander has all of the features of the Matrix 6, which inherited them, but it also has a multi-mode filter that can be configured 15 different ways. If you've ever wondered the difference between a 1-pole filter and a 3-pole filter, you can actually try it out in the expander. You've got notch filters, like I said, but you also have interesting ones like notch and low pass at the same time, or phase filters, so it works more like a phaser. It is extremely deep. I'm lucky enough to have a Matrix 12. I'm the luckiest guy on the planet to have this in the studio. And a Matrix 12 is just two expanders stacked together. I would never recommend anybody to spend as much money as I did on a Matrix 12, but an expander, although it is a lot of money, at least you can say you're getting a lot of bang for your buck, because I can't even think of any modern synthesizer that can do what the expander does. Speaking of $5,000, let's talk about the most premium Moog you can get, which is actually a vintage mini Moog for just under $5,000. Normally, I wouldn't mention a mini Moog in a video like this because this would be in that upper echelon tier of vanity synths. Mini Moogs tended to hover around 10 grand a year or two ago. For whatever reason, the price has fallen quite a bit. So if you're ever been one of those people who's been considering getting a real vintage mini Moog, the synth that started it all, $5,000 is a lot. I can't stress this enough. It is so much money for a synth that simple. But it is the paragon. It is the synthesizer by which all other synthesizers have been judged. And so for its place in history, maybe it's worth that $5,000 for you. If nothing else, I can't imagine the prices of these falling any further. Next up, let's talk about the OB-Series of Oberheim synth. And if you want to get an Oberheim OB-Synth, you actually can get one on Reverb right now for $5,150. However, once again, Gear Trader is swooping underneath that, and you can actually get an Oberheim OB-8 for $5,050 right now. So the OB-8 is sort of like the Roland JX10 in that you can see it's this missing link in the evolution from the OB-XA to the expander. The OB-8 has many more features than the OB-XA by incorporating page 2, which is a feature they're still putting in synths like the Oberheim OB-X8 today. And if you want that OB sound, which is different than the Matrix and Expander sound, it is really cool that you can get it at this price because usually these synths hover up higher. OB-Xs are still ungodly expensive. Oberheim OB-XAs, the classic original blue striped version, hovers closer to $6,000. Now for me, and this is just my personal opinion here, the OB-8 is sort of a redheaded stepchild for this reason. They implemented a much better tuning system in the OB-8, which meant that they could tune those oscillators really tightly to the point where they're almost like DCOs in the fact that they don't drift a whole lot. And even Tom Oberheim said that he prefers the sound of the OB-X and OB-XA over the OB-8 expander and matrices because of that tuning instability. It felt more wild. Now in the OB-8, they added detune functions. That way you could get a thicker sound. But if you're going for that vintage Oberheim sound, I really think the OB-XA for $1,000 more might be what you're looking for. And for the same $5,000, I would get an expander all day, every day over the OB-8. In my opinion, it's just a much more interesting and deep synthesizer. So there's a way in which the OB-8 is kind of in an uncanny valley where it's not quite as wild and vintage sounding as the OB-XA, and it's not quite as deep in terms of digital modulation matrices as the expander and matrix series. So there's a way in which it could be a less satisfying synthesizer to have, although I'm sure it's still a jaw-droppingly gorgeous sounding synth. Let's talk about profits. So the Prophet 5 started it all in 1978, designed by Dave Smith and John Bowen. This was the first synthesizer to have a microprocessor put in it, and it was fully programmable. And really, all of the synths I've been talking about, all of the synths behind me, are following in that archetype. We're about to talk about 3 synthesizers that all cost exactly $5,300, which I find fascinating. It's another one of those psychological things. It's like just above $5,000. You can actually buy an original vintage Prophet 5 Rev 3 right now for $5,300. So the Rev 3 was the version that adopted Curtis filters instead of SSM filters in Revs 1 and 2. I never thought I'd see Prophet 5s fall this far in price. Again, like mini Moogs, they hovered closer to the 10 grand sort of range. And although it might not be quite as desirable in today's studios as a Rev 2 with the SSM components, back in the day, most musicians actually opted to upgrade from the Rev 2 to the Rev 3 for increased stability. The SSM parts just were failing much more commonly, and the Curtis parts were much better. It did change the sound of the Prophet somewhat, but with everything being said, it still is the sound of vintage analog polysynths. Again, it's the paragon of what synthesizers were and what they will always be in our collective memory. But for me, if I had $5,300 to spend on a Prophet, there's no doubt in my mind I would spend it on a Prophet VS. Prophet VS is a hybrid synthesizer from 1986. It's got 8 voices, and each voice has 4 oscillators. The big thing about the VS is that joystick. So this was the invention of vector synthesis. This synthesizer is very deep. It has a sound unlike anything else. It is wild and aggressive in the most beautiful way. The Prophet VS is sort of the white whale of the studio. I really want to get one day. I just think it's a masterpiece. And when it comes to hybrid synthesizers, which I love, there's really only two other synths that could challenge the VS for being king of the hybrid synthesizers. That would be the original PPG Wave, right? Which is really a different thing than the Prophet VS. That's more about scanning through wavetables. The VS is more about blending and doing all sorts of crazy stuff with that joystick. Or the Waldorf Wave, which is basically unobtainium. Only about 300 were made. And for the final category of this entire video, we're going to talk about Jupiter synthesizers. As I mentioned, we're talking about 3 vintage synths that all cost $5,300. The Prophet 5 Rev 3, the Prophet VS, and now the Jupiter 6. So if I had $5,300 to spend on one of these synthesizers, my ranking would probably go Prophet VS, Prophet 5 Rev 3, and then the Jupiter 6. For me, the Jupiter 6 is a fine polysynth, but the sound to me didn't sound as good as the Chroma Polaris. I know it has the multi-mode filter, but the implementation of the resonance in that synth is odd. The Jupiter 8 has really good resonance compensation, which basically means as you crank the resonance, it feeds more input from the oscillators into the filter to compensate for that, so you don't lose as much bass and the whole signal doesn't become just that resonant peak. But on the Jupiter 6, they actually went in the opposite direction and boost the peak more. There is a mod for that, I think, but basically the Jupiter 6 is kind of an odd duck in terms of sound. I would love to have one in the studio. I'd really love to check it out. But just from the perspective of like, okay, so what's the most awesome synthesizer you can get for that? Well, the Prophet 5, there's your history and nostalgia. There's that sound. The Prophet VS is sort of like the expander is to the Oberheim OB-Series. It's totally unique. Nothing else sounds like a Prophet VS even to this day. And then the Jupiter 6 is like the less desirable Roland Jupiter. But nevertheless, you can get it for $5,300. I think a better deal would be to spend $4,600 on a Super Jupiter. So the Super Jupiter is sort of a Rackmount version of the Jupiter 6, but it has a bass boost circuit. The other thing that makes this Rackmount synth really awesome is that it responds to velocity and aftertouch, making it the only Jupiter to do so. $4,600 is a lot for a Rackmount synthesizer, I get that. But if you're looking for an authentic vintage Jupiter sound, this is currently the most affordable way to do it. Okay, let's finish this video up with a little market analysis and talk about some of the trends and predictions I have for the vintage synth market in 2025 and 2026. Now, if you'll look at this spreadsheet of the prices of 37 vintage synthesizers, the prices in the left column are from last year's video and the prices in the right column are from this year's video. If you total it up and divide it out, you'll see that the average price of a vintage synthesizer on this list went up by 3% over last year's price. That doesn't mean all of the vintage synths went up by 3%. I've highlighted some examples in this video where the prices actually went down. But on average, they went up by 3%, which is pretty good. Last year, I took some heat for saying 2024 would be remembered as the year the vintage synthesizer market crashed. However, unless there is another major crash coming, which I don't think there will be, 2024 will be the low point in the recent past and foreseeable future. And if, after watching my video last year, you went out and bought a vintage synthesizer, congratulations, it's on average gone up in value by 3%. So how does that number compare to inflation? The consumer price index for the past year is 2.4%. That's basically the rate of inflation. Vintage synth prices going up by 3% means you're 0.6% ahead of inflation. It's only 0.6% better. However, when you consider that a US Treasury bond only returns about 4% per year and your money is tied up for the duration of the bond, 3% is actually not a terrible return on investment. I'm not saying you should dump all of your savings into vintage synths like it's the next crypto. But if you bought a vintage synthesizer when I said it was a good time to do so last year, you've actually made money by owning that synthesizer ahead of inflation, which is awesome. Now you might be thinking to yourself, okay, but what if this is the new high point and prices go back down? I have a theory for why prices are probably not going down anytime soon. So far this video, I've successfully avoided the elephant in the room, the United States trade war. Tariffs are a real thing that are going to affect the synthesizer economy more and more. Prices of some synthesizers have already gone up 50% or more because of the tariffs that America's put on China in particular. And like it or not, most of the parts that go into the synthesizers we love come from China. I'm not interested in the politics of this. I just want to talk about how this is going to affect both the modern and vintage synth market. My prediction would be that we're going to see a lot of increased interest in the used market, not just for vintage synths, by the way, but for modern synths as well. I'll give you an example. Let's say you watched my best synths of 2024 video last year and decided you wanted to buy a sequential Take 5 brand new for $1,350. That same synthesizer is selling for $1,700 at Sweetwater today. And consider someone else looking at the sequential Take 5 today. Maybe they could afford $1,350. $1,500 is a stretch, but they can't do $1,700. It's just too much. There's a lot of psychology too that goes into price points. I really think our brains process numbers bigger than 1,500, different than they process numbers less than 1,500, and the same thing with 2,000, 2,500, and so on. So this person might start scrolling Reverb to see if there's any used ones. Now let's say you decide you want to move on from your Take 5. You put it up on Reverb for $1,500. Even if you eat $100 in shipping, you still got paid to own that synth. And the guy who's looking for this synthesizer gets it $200 cheaper than everybody else. It's a win-win for everybody involved. In 2024, I would have assumed that if you went to sell your Take 5 a year after owning it, it would have devalued by anywhere from 20 to 30%. But that's not the case anymore. You actually could sell that synthesizer at what you paid for it, or maybe even make money on it. And so this situation is going to dramatically change the used market. I predict there's going to be many people who previously would have balked at buying a used synthesizer will now consider the possibility. So what's that mean for the market? If a bunch of new people start looking at used synthesizers and buying them up at cheaper prices than what they would pay new, the supply is going to go down, the demand is high. What does that mean? That means the price is going to come up. Now, of course, the tariff situation is ongoing, evolving, and capricious. Who the fuck knows where we're going to be next year? But what I can say is it's unlikely that modern synthesizer prices are going to fall back to where they were last year. We still haven't truly felt the effects of the tariffs as companies are using up the last of their parts and still selling the models that were assembled before. It's also likely that we will see some stagnation in the synthesizer market. Most, if not all, synthesizer companies have played it safe and not made big investments into R&D in this period of uncertainty. I think when this new normal is found, synthesizer companies will begin development on new products, but there's a cycle. It takes years to take a product from initial concept to market. So there's going to be a gap, most likely, between the products that we see right now and new products. It might be a couple of years before we start to see real innovation in the industry again. And in that period, it is possible that people will get bored with the synthesizers that are out. It's hard to imagine that the synths that came out last year will have the same hype in a couple of years. And that could lead to increased interest in the vintage synthesizer market as well. So, is now a good time to buy a vintage synthesizer? I'm pretty confident in saying yes. Of course, 2024 probably would have been the best time to buy a vintage synth, as the prices have increased on average by 3%. But I do not see them going down anytime soon for the reasons I've outlined. I think it's very likely that there's going to be more eyes on vintage synthesizers as actually a more economical alternative to modern synths going forward. And as these cheaply priced vintage synths get eaten up, prices are going to increase. And so if you buy a vintage synth now, it is likely that its value will increase over the coming years. As for trends in the market, there are really only two that I've noticed. One is the dropping of the price of some of the most extremely expensive synthesizers like Jupiter 8s, Mini Moogs, and Prophet 5s. I think this is just a reaction to the fact that most people are not selling really expensive vintage synths right now. The other trend that I noticed is exemplified best with the JP8000. For a long time, JP8000 prices have kind of been in a rut. They've been hanging around the $500-600 mark, and they're finally starting to go up to where they were during the great synthflation of 2020. And like I said, it's only going to take one producer to pull a Blinding Lights, but with a 90s synthesizer, to revive 90s nostalgia and make those synths super covetable. I'm not sure that's going to happen, but it feels like a very real possibility, and you would expect prices to go up. One thing I would caution about those digital synths is people have a perception that plugins, VSTs can do a great job emulating digital vintage synthesizers and a less great job with the analog ones. So in some ways, just by looking through that particular lens of perception, you are still maybe better off buying a vintage analog or at least hybrid synthesizer than some of the digital ones. However, there are a bunch of vintage digital synths like the Korg O&W that are not currently emulated in software. I imagine they will be one day, but in the interim, it might be a really good buy. And looking at the cost of Juno 6s coming down below that of the Juno 106 for the first time, I can't help but think that the 80s nostalgia thing has faded. I think synthwave is like jazz. It's never going away. It's a genre that's going to be with us forever now. But I do think lo-fi beats and certain other genres that are adjacent to that might have gotten more of people's attention. And so I do think that there's going to be more emphasis on modern and vintage synths that make those types of sounds maybe better than a Roland DCO synth with that famous chorus. It's a very specific sound. It's a very synthwavy sound. And I think it might be on its way out just a little bit. Okay, so that wraps up this year's video. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. I know this is a long video. I make these videos to encourage people to check out vintage synthesizers. I don't think I'm going to do a video as long as this one again, but I wanted to really highlight that there are 65 incredible vintage synthesizers under $2,000 out there. I hope you found this video helpful. Continue to be excellent, and I will see you in the next video.